Roberto Mendez sadly watched the last car drive away down the dirt road that descended from his old family home in the mountains of Oaxaca, carrying with it his youngest son and his grandchildren, who had promised to visit him soon with the same tone of casual disingenuousness that had characterized their interactions over the past 5 years since his wife Maria had passed away. "They don't come back, do they?" he murmured into the emptiness of his deteriorating living room, his words echoing against the cracked walls of the wooden cabin he had built with his own hands 40 years ago when his young family needed refuge and a home in the mountains that now kept him isolated from the modern world his children inhabited in the coastal cities where their professional lives left no room for elderly parents who remembered simpler times. The loneliness that enveloped Roberto in that moment of final abandonment reflected the fate of millions of elderly people in Mexico and Latin America whose children migrated to urban opportunities, leaving behind the parents who had raised them with sacrifice and love that now seemed forgotten or irrelevant in the face of the economic and social pressures of contemporary life. 73 years working as a peasant and artisan, Roberto reflected, contemplating his calloused hands that had tilled the land, carved wood, and built a life for a family that now considered him an inconvenient burden rather than a treasure worthy of respect and care. And in the end they leave me alone on this mountain as if I were an old piece of furniture that no longer serves a purpose. His bitter assessment of his situation reflected not only personal pain but also a social critique of how modernization and urbanization had eroded the traditional values of family responsibility and respect for the elderly that had characterized Mexican culture for centuries. The sound of footsteps on the porch outside interrupted his melancholic thoughts, and Roberto was surprised to see another elderly man standing in his doorway, carrying a small, worn suitcase and a similarly defeated expression that suggested a shared experience of abandonment and loneliness that had brought this stranger to his doorstep in the remote mountains of Oaxaca. "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Alberto Fuentes," the visitor said, his voice weary, reflecting both the physical exhaustion of having walked for miles on mountain roads and the emotional drain of someone who had lost all sense of belonging and purpose in the world. "I saw your cabin from the road and was wondering if you might need help with repairs or labor in exchange for a place to stay for a few nights while I decide what to do with my life now that my children have left me at a nursing home in the city. I escaped this morning because I'd rather die with dignity in the mountains than rot in an institution where you're treated like an object rather than a person." The desperation in his explanation resonated deeply with Roberto, who recognized in this stranger a kindred spirit who shared his experience of familial abandonment and rejection by the younger generation who valued convenience over compassion and material success over filial obligation. "Please come in," Roberto responded with a warmth that surprised both men given the context of their first meetings. "It seems that you and I have more in common than either of us would like to admit, and perhaps fate has brought us together for a reason that neither of us can yet understand, but that might give our final years meaning instead of leaving us to wither away in loneliness and despair." His invitation reflected an intuition that the solution to their isolation from each other might be found in companionship and collaboration rather than passively accepting the abandonment their families had imposed upon them. The conversation that unfolded over the next few hours over coffee and tortillas revealed remarkably similar stories of men who had dedicated their lives to building homes and supporting families who had ultimately discarded them as inconveniences when age and physical limitations rendered them perceived burdens rather than respected patriarchs whose wisdom and experience deserved honor rather than institutional abandonment or geographic isolation. "I worked for 30 years as a carpenter in Puebla," Alberto explained as he surveyed the cabin's deteriorating construction with a professional eye that identified structural problems and opportunities for improvement. "And I built homes for dozens of families who still live in buildings I created with these hands. But when my wife died and my knees could no longer handle the constant physical labor, my 3 sons decided it would be easier to put me in a nursing home than to make room for me. In their busy lives filled with technology and ambition that have no room for old men who remember how things were done before everything became disposable and temporary." His story of professional contribution followed by familial rejection reflected societal patterns affecting millions of elderly people whose traditional skills and cultural values were deemed obsolete in modern societies that prioritized youth, technological innovation, and economic mobility over generational continuity and accumulated wisdom. Roberto and Alberto's collaborative inspection of the cabin over the next few days revealed both the extent of its structural deterioration and the potential for transformation that could give them shared purpose and renew a sense of personal worth that the family's abandonment had eroded. "This cabin has good bones," Alberto observed with professional appreciation as he examined the wooden beams Roberto had installed decades earlier. "But it needs extensive roof work, the exterior walls are rotten in several places, and the existing plumbing system is basically non-existent by modern standards, although I imagine you've been using the well and outhouse for years without much concern for urban amenities." His technical assessment was accurate but not critical, reflecting respect for Roberto's accomplishments in building and maintaining family shelter under harsh rural conditions. "I built this in 1983 with materials I could obtain locally and borrowed tools," Roberto explained with pride mixed with melancholy as he recalled when the cabin represented hope and a family future rather than a monument to neglect and loneliness. "And at the time it seemed like a palace compared to the adobe hut where I grew up. But you're right that it needs extensive repairs that are beyond my current physical capabilities, although my mind still remembers how to do the job if I had help and the proper materials." Their recognition of physical limitations combined with their preservation of technical knowledge created a basis for collaboration where the complementary skills of both men could compensate for the individual weaknesses that age had imposed on their abilities. "How would you feel if we worked together to restore this cabin? You know the property and have local expertise, I have carpentry and construction skills, and together we could transform this place into something special that shows we are still capable of contributing and creating instead of simply waiting to die in loneliness and despair." Alberto proposed with growing enthusiasm as he imagined a project that would give structure and meaning to their days while demonstrating that the elderly still possessed value and the ability to create beauty and functionality despite societal rejection. "You know the property and have local expertise, I have carpentry and construction skills, and together we could transform this place into something special that shows we are still capable of contributing and creating instead of simply waiting to die in loneliness and despair." Their proposal articulated a shared aspiration to regain dignity and purpose through meaningful work that would produce tangible results while challenging societal narratives of the elderly as unproductive burdens. "I like that idea," Roberto agreed with the first genuine smile he'd experienced in months. "And I think we could do something truly special here if we combine our skills and experiences in ways that none of us could achieve individually in our current conditions." The decision to collaborate on a restoration project would transform both of their lives while demonstrating the power of intergenerational community and the continued value of traditional skills in a modern world that frequently dismisses both as irrelevant. The detailed planning Roberto and Alberto undertook during their first week of collaboration revealed an ambitious vision that extended beyond simple structural repair to a complete transformation that would turn the deteriorating cabin into a beautiful retreat honoring Mexican architectural traditions while incorporating practical innovations that would improve the quality of life for its elderly inhabitants. "We need to start with the roof," Alberto declared as he sketched basic plans on recycled paper. "Because everything else we do will be useless if water keeps seeping in and damaging the interior structure. So my recommendation is that we completely replace the existing tiles with new materials we can obtain in the nearest town if we have the money for materials." Their professional prioritization of structural issues reflected construction experience that ensured their project would be executed in a logical sequence that would maximize effectiveness while minimizing waste of the limited effort their elderly bodies could provide. "I have some money saved from my pension," Roberto revealed after carefully considering the trust he would place in his new partner. "Not much, maybe 30,000 pesos I was setting aside for medical emergencies. But I guess building a decent home qualifies as an emergency if the alternative is living in ruins that will eventually collapse on our heads." His willingness to invest limited resources in a shared project demonstrated commitment to their collaboration, while recognizing that spending savings on home improvements would provide a better return than simply hoarding money for medical crises that might never materialize. "I also have some," Alberto added, About 20,000 pesos I managed to stash before my children put me in the asylum, so between the two of us, we have enough to get started with basic materials while using traditional construction techniques that minimize costs by taking advantage of the natural resources available in these mountains. His financial contribution matched Roberto's commitment, while his reference to traditional techniques suggested a sustainable approach that would honor cultural heritage while producing practical results. The combined budget of 50,000 pesos represented modest resources by urban standards but sufficient capital for a rural renovation project if carefully managed and complemented by extensive manual labor that both men were willing to provide despite their age-related physical limitations. We also need to think about the interior design, Roberto suggested as he envisioned possibilities for spaces that had remained unchanged for decades. Because if we're going to invest all this effort, we should create something that's both functional and beautiful rather than simply repairing what already exists without improving it in ways that make our daily lives more comfortable and enjoyable. Their aesthetic aspiration reflected a desire to create beauty that transcended practical necessity while demonstrating that the elderly still valued quality of life and artistic expression despite the societal neglect that had suggested their preferences and comfort no longer mattered. The physical labor that began with the removal of the damaged roof proved simultaneously challenging and therapeutic for both men, who found that the collaborative effort provided daily structure and a sense of accomplishment that had been lacking since their families had abandoned them to unproductive solitude. "My knees are protesting every step of this ladder," Alberto humorously admitted as he carefully climbed onto the roof to assess the damage. "But there's something satisfying about using my body for productive work instead of just sitting in a chair watching television in a nursing home where they treat you as if you're already dead." His acknowledgement of physical discomfort combined with appreciation for meaningful work reflected an understanding that quality of life depended more on purpose and autonomy than passive physical comfort. "It's the same for me," Roberto agreed as he held the ladder with trembling hands that still retained enough strength to contribute significantly to the project. "My back reminds me every morning that I am 73 years old, but I prefer the honest pain that comes from creative construction to the dull ache of purposeless existence I felt before you came to my door." His philosophical articulation of the difference between productive physical suffering and sterile existential angst provided a framework for understanding why both men were willing to push their bodies beyond comfortable limits in search of meaning and dignity. The slow but steady progress in removing the old roof and preparing the structure for new materials created psychological momentum that energized both men as they saw tangible evidence that they still possessed the capacity to transform their physical surroundings despite limitations imposed by age and social neglect. "Look at that," Alberto noted with visible satisfaction as they exposed the wooden beams Roberto had installed 4 decades earlier. "Your original construction was solid and well done, which means our task is to restore and improve rather than rebuild from scratch, saving time and money while honoring the work you did when you were young." His professional acknowledgement of Roberto's work validated decades of effort, while reinforcing the value of traditional skills that modern society frequently dismissed as obsolete. The collaboration between Roberto's local experience and Alberto's technical expertise created a synergy that enabled faster progress than either man could have achieved working alone, demonstrating the fundamental principle that community and cooperation amplify individual capabilities in ways that benefit all participants. Acquiring building materials in the nearby town of San Miguel del Valle provided an unexpected opportunity for social interaction that had been lacking in both men's isolated lives, while also revealing community attitudes toward the elderly that oscillated between traditional respect and modern condescension. "Are you two going to be doing construction work at your age?" the hardware store owner asked with a mixture of incredulity and admiration when Roberto and Alberto explained their restoration project. "Most men of your generation are content to sit in the park and play dominoes rather than climb on roofs and carry heavy materials that could cause serious injury." His comment reflected generational assumptions about age-related limitations while revealing prejudices about what the elderly should or should not attempt to accomplish. "Well, it turns out we prefer to build than sit around waiting for death," Alberto responded with dignity that brooked no condescension. "And our bodies may not be as strong as they once were, but our minds still function perfectly, and we know how to work within our capabilities without unnecessarily risking our health. Their defense of elderly competence politely challenged ageist attitudes while asserting the right to autonomy and self-determination regardless of chronological age. "I didn't mean to offend," the tradesman quickly apologized. "In fact, it's refreshing to see men your age with ambitious projects instead of simply surrendering to the limitations society imposes on older people. So let me help you select appropriate materials, and perhaps I can give you a discount because I admire what you're doing and want to support your efforts." His shift from skepticism to support demonstrated how respectful confrontation could educate about elderly capabilities while creating community alliances that facilitated beneficial projects. The 20% discount the tradesman ultimately offered on building materials represented both practical financial support and social validation of the value of the project Roberto and Alberto had undertaken, providing additional economic resources while reinforcing a sense of shared purpose. The conversation at the hardware store attracted the attention of other customers who heard about the restoration project and began offering assistance in various ways, from lending specialized tools to sharing knowledge about traditional construction techniques that could reduce costs while producing superior results to modern methods that relied on expensive materials and professional labor. The return to the cabin with building materials loaded onto a pickup truck borrowed from a supportive neighbor marked a psychological turning point where an abstract project became a tangible reality, generating enthusiasm and renewed commitment from both men. "This is real now," Roberto observed as they unloaded shingles, lumber, and tools that would transform their vision into physical reality. "We have the materials, we have the plan, and we have the skills to make this work if we work together and don't give up when things get tough." Their acknowledgement of future challenges reflected realism that balanced optimism about possibilities with a practical understanding that completing the project would require persistence in the face of inevitable obstacles. "We also have something that many elders don't have," Alberto added as he organized materials in a way that would facilitate efficient work. "We have a shared purpose that gives us reason to get up each morning and push our bodies beyond what would be comfortable if we were simply trying to pass the time until we died. And that purpose is worth more than any amount of passive physical comfort." Their philosophical articulation of the value of purpose over comfort provided a motivational framework that would sustain their efforts through months of demanding physical labor requiring both psychological and physical endurance. The first night after acquiring materials, both men slept better than they had in months, their physical exhaustion from the workday combining with the psychological satisfaction of progress toward a meaningful goal provided a dramatic contrast to the anxious insomnia that had characterized their previous periods of abandonment and loneliness. Restful sleep reflected the fundamental principle that human well-being depended more on a sense of purpose and social connection than on material circumstances or passive physical comfort, which modern societies frequently mistakenly equate with optimal quality of life. The cabin's visible transformation over the following weeks began to attract the attention of local residents passing by on the mountain road, noticing dramatic improvements to a structure many had assumed was abandoned or beyond repair. "Don Roberto, I saw you're working on your house," commented Carmen Martinez, a neighbor who lived a mile down the mountain. "And I'm impressed to see what you and your friend have accomplished in such a short time with just the two of you working without any professional help." Her observation combined genuine admiration with curiosity about how two elderly men were accomplishing significant construction work without outside assistance from younger, more physically capable workers. "Thank you, Dona Carmen," Roberto responded with evident pride. "My friend Alberto was a professional carpenter, and between his technical expertise and my local knowledge of the property, we've been able to make significant progress, although I admit there are days when our bodies remind us we're no longer 20. His humorous acknowledgement of age-related physical limitations didn't minimize their accomplishments but rather made them more impressive given the context of the obvious disadvantages they had overcome. "Do you need any help?" Carmen offered, "Because my son has the weekend off, and I think he'd be willing to contribute a few hours of work if you need additional labor for more physically demanding tasks." Their offer of family assistance reflected traditional community values about mutual support while providing practical resources that could significantly accelerate the project. Roberto's grateful acceptance of the offered assistance initiated a pattern of community support that gradually expanded to include several local residents who contributed time, skills, or materials to the restoration project while finding meaning and connection through participation in a collective effort that benefited abandoned elderly people. The phenomenon of community mobilization around Roberto and Alberto's project demonstrated the fundamental principle that compelling human stories of overcoming and resilience could catalyze social action that transcended self-interest to create collective benefits that strengthened the community fabric while providing practical support to vulnerable members of society. The photographic documentation Carmen began taking of the renovation progress eventually found its way to social media, where the story of two abandoned elderly people transforming a deteriorating cabin into a beautiful refuge captured the imagination of regional and eventually national audiences. Don Roberto and Don Alberto's story has gone viral, Carmen enthusiastically reported after her Facebook post racked up thousands of shares and comments. And people all over Mexico are inspired by their determination to create something beautiful despite the abandonment they suffered from their families. The social media impact of their story amplified her message about the courage and capacity of elders while generating material support from strangers who wanted to contribute to the project. Monetary donations that began pouring in through the crowdfunding platform Carmen established with Roberto and Alberto's permission provided additional financial resources that expanded the renovation possibilities beyond basic repairs to the creation of a truly exceptional refuge that would demonstrate the potential of traditional Mexican design and craftsmanship. We never imagined that our small renovation project would attract so much attention, Alberto reflected while reviewing messages of support from across the country. But it seems that our story resonates with many people who also feel abandoned or undervalued by a modern society that values youth and novelty over experience and wisdom. His analysis of the cultural impact of his story identified a broader societal need for positive narratives about aging that challenged stereotypes about inevitable decline and social burden that frequently characterized media portrayals of older adults. The media interest that followed included interviews with regional newspapers and eventually an appearance on a national television program about home renovation, which highlighted his project as an inspiring example of elderly resilience and the value of traditional skills in the modern world. The media exposure transformed his personal project into a cultural symbol that influenced national discussions about elder neglect, intergenerational solidarity, and the need for social policies that support dignified aging rather than the institutionalization or isolation of older adults. The expansion of the renovation project to include additional features such as a medicinal herb garden, a carpentry workshop, and space to host visitors reflected both additional resources available through donations and an expanded vision of what their mountain retreat could represent and provide. With the additional money we have received, Roberto proposed during the planning session, we could create space where other abandoned elders could come visit us and learn traditional skills while finding community and purpose that their families no longer provide. His vision of extending the benefits of his experience to other elders in similar situations reflected generosity and a social consciousness that transcended personal gain to address broader community needs. I love that idea, Alberto enthusiastically agreed. And we could offer workshops on carpentry, traditional agriculture, and other skills that elders possess but that younger generations are losing because modern education doesn't value practical knowledge that doesn't generate immediate returns in the digital economy. His conceptualization of an intergenerational educational project that would preserve traditional knowledge while providing purpose to marginalized elders demonstrated systems thinking about how to address multiple social challenges simultaneously. The implementation of a medicinal herb garden, which incorporated traditional knowledge about healing plants, provided both a practical resource for personal health and an educational opportunity for visitors interested in natural medicine, which modern healthcare systems often dismissed as superstition without scientific basis. The carpentry workshop, equipped with tools donated by supporters, allowed Alberto to resume his craft while teaching traditional techniques to young volunteers who came to help with the project, and they discovered the value of manual skills rarely emphasized in modern formal education. The visitor hosting space created an opportunity for isolated elders from across the region to experience temporary community and participate in meaningful activities that challenged societal narratives of elders as unproductive and dependent, rather than valuable contributors with relevant knowledge and skills. The project's impact on Roberto and Alberto's personal lives and psychological well-being was profound and multifaceted, transforming their experience of abandonment and despair into renewed purpose and fulfillment that reflected fundamental principles about human needs for autonomy, competence, and social connection. I feel more alive now at 73 than I did during the last 5 years after Maria died and my children stopped visiting me, Roberto reflected during a late-night conversation with Alberto about his personal transformation. Because I have daily purpose, meaningful work that produces visible results, and a partner who understands my experiences and values rather than seeing me as a burden or a relic of the past. Their articulation of improved well-being identified specific components of quality of life that the project had restored while providing a contrast to a previous period of isolation and depression. I also feel reborn, Alberto shared. And I realized that the asylum where my children placed me was not only a physical prison but also a psychological one that robbed me of agency and purpose by treating me as an object that needed to be maintained rather than a person capable of contributing and creating value. Their comparison between passive institutionalization and self-determined mountain activity highlighted fundamental differences in approaches to elders that respected versus denied basic autonomy and human capacity. The sense of pride both men experienced when visitors commented on the beauty and quality of their renovation work provided external validation that reinforced their self-worth while challenging internalized societal messages about elderly irrelevance and worthlessness that familial neglect had amplified. The recognition that their story inspired other elders to seek purpose and community rather than passively accept isolation and decline amplified the meaning of their project beyond personal benefit to a broader social contribution that multiplied the impact of their individual efforts. The completion of the renovation project after 8 months of intense work revealed an extraordinary transformation that exceeded even the optimistic expectations Roberto and Alberto had had when they began their collaboration. The once deteriorating cabin now shone with a new traditional red tile roof, restored exterior walls showcasing handcrafted woodwork, and enlarged windows that flooded the interior with natural light while offering panoramic views of the surrounding Oaxacan mountains. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," Roberto murmured with visible emotion as he contemplated the final result of their collaborative work. And it represents not only the renewal of the physical structure but also the renewal of our lives and our sense of value as human beings who still have much to contribute to the world despite what our families and society have led us to believe about our worthlessness. His interpretation of the project as a metaphor for personal resilience and renewal provided a philosophical framework for understanding meaning that transcended concrete physical achievements toward deeper psychological and social transformation. The cabin's interiors reflected aesthetics that honored Mexican architectural traditions while incorporating modern amenities that enhanced functionality without compromising the cultural integrity or character of the space. A newly designed kitchen, equipped with a traditional wood-burning stove complemented by modern gas appliances, allowed for meal preparation that respected traditional culinary methods while providing contemporary efficiency. The living room featured handmade furniture by Alberto, showcasing mastery of traditional carpentry with designs incorporating Oaxacan cultural motifs carved into the backrests and armrests. Separate bedrooms provided much-needed privacy while maintaining a sense of social connection through an open layout that facilitated conversation and natural interaction between occupants. The common space, designed for workshops and community gatherings, could accommodate up to 20 people, allowing the cabin to serve as a center for intergenerational education and the preservation of traditional knowledge, which the project's expanded vision was intended to facilitate. The community-organized ribbon-cutting ceremony to celebrate the project's completion attracted more than 100 people, including local neighbors, volunteers who had contributed their work, donors who had provided financial support, and media reporters who had followed the story of transformation. We want to thank the entire community that supported us throughout this project. Alberto spoke during the ceremony with a moving voice, because what began as an effort by two abandoned men to create a decent shelter has become a community movement that demonstrates the power of human solidarity and the persistent courage of the elderly in a society that often dismisses us as irrelevant. His speech articulated the project's social dimension while acknowledging the contributions of others that have amplified its impact. This project taught us that we are never too old to start over, Roberto added as he looked out at the gathered crowd, and that family abandonment doesn't have to define our later years if we have the courage to seek community, purpose, and dignity in ways that modern society doesn't always recognize or value. His philosophical message about elderly resilience resonated deeply with attendees, who included several other elders facing similar situations of isolation or marginalization who had been inspired by Roberto and Alberto's story to seek alternatives to passive resignation. The mayor of San Miguel del Valle gave a speech acknowledging the project as a model for community-based initiatives that could address the growing crisis of elder abandonment in rural regions of Mexico, where young people were migrating to cities, leaving aging parents without adequate family support. Don Roberto and Don Alberto have demonstrated that investment in older people is not charity but rather recognition of valuable human resources that our communities need to harness rather than discard, declared the mayor. And their project will inspire municipal policies to support active and productive aging that benefits all of society. Their political commitment to replicating the model in other areas represented institutional validation of the principles embodied by the project regarding the continued value of older adults. The tears that streamed down both men's cheeks during the celebration reflected not only pride in their physical achievements but also deep emotional gratitude for having found redemption and purpose after experiencing devastating rejection that could have easily destroyed their will to live had they not fortuitously met and decided to collaborate in a transformation that saved both their lives. The ceremony concluded with a traditional Oaxacan meal prepared by neighbors using recipes Roberto had learned from his late wife, creating an atmosphere of cultural celebration that honored the past while looking to a future filled with renewed possibilities for dignified and meaningful aging. The national media attention that Roberto and Alberto's story received after the inauguration catalyzed important conversations about elder neglect, family responsibility, and the need for social policies that support dignified aging throughout Latin America. The story of these two men has touched a societal nerve, reported journalist Elena Ramirez during a nightly news segment, because millions of Latin American families face dilemmas about how to balance obligations to aging parents with the economic pressures of modern life that make it increasingly difficult to provide traditional family care that cultures historically valued. Her analysis contextualized Roberto and Alberto's personal experiences within broader demographic and social trends affecting population aging across the region. Talk shows invited both men to discuss their experiences, providing a platform for articulating perspectives on aging that challenged dominant narratives of the elderly as passive burdens requiring institutionalization or dependent care. Society needs to recognize that the contribution of older adults doesn't end when we retire from the formal workforce, Alberto argued during a televised interview, because we possess decades of practical knowledge, cultural wisdom, and traditional skills that have enormous value if communities create opportunities for us to share those resources instead of assuming we are obsolete. His advocacy for social recognition of older adults' value articulated a fundamental principle that the project had concretely demonstrated. The public response included thousands of messages from older adults in similar situations expressing gratitude for the model of resilience that the story provided while sharing their own experiences of abandonment or marginalization, validating that Roberto and Alberto were not isolated cases but rather representatives of a widespread social phenomenon requiring institutional attention. Policy proposals that emerged from public conversations included intergenerational housing programs, community centers for active seniors, and tax incentives for families that kept elderly parents in their homes rather than institutionalizing them, reflecting growing government recognition that the crisis of older adult abandonment required systemic responses that went beyond individual solutions or isolated initiatives. The project's long-term legacy manifested in multiple replications across Mexico, where communities organized similar initiatives to support abandoned elders while preserving traditional knowledge and skills that modernization threatened to erase. We have identified at least 30 projects directly inspired by Don Roberto and Don Alberto's story, reported a non-governmental organization focused on elder rights, including traditional craft workshops, collaborative housing programs for the elderly, and intergenerational education centers where older adults teach skills that formal education systems do not provide. The multiplier effect of their story demonstrated how compelling narratives about human resilience could catalyze social change that benefited entire communities while addressing needs that formal institutions had neglected. The nonprofit foundation that Roberto and Alberto established with surplus crowdfunding donations provided resources to support elderly people in situations of abandonment, while creating a network of similar shelters in rural regions where geographic isolation exacerbated older adults' vulnerability. We want no senior to have to feel the despair we felt when our families abandoned us, Roberto explained during an interview about the founding mission. And we believe that by providing material resources combined with opportunities for meaningful work and community, we can help older adults regain the dignity and purpose that modern society often denies them. His philanthropic vision extended the impact of his personal experience into systemic change that could benefit thousands of older adults facing similar circumstances. Alberto and Roberto's lives became a testament to the transformative power of shared purpose and community in the face of adversity that could have easily destroyed them had they passively accepted societal narratives of elderly worthlessness instead of resisting them through creative action and mutual collaboration that demonstrated the enduring courage of human beings regardless of chronological age or family circumstances. The reunion that eventually occurred between Roberto and his sons was complex and emotionally charged, forcing both generations to confront the wounds of abandonment while negotiating the possibility of reconciliation that honored the past without denying the pain it had caused. "Father, we saw the story on television," his eldest son Javier admitted during an awkward visit several months after the inauguration, "and it made us realize how badly we treated you when we decided it would be easier for everyone if we simply left you here instead of making room for you in our lives." His acknowledgement of guilt represented the first step toward healing, although Roberto acknowledged that genuine reconciliation would require more than verbal apologies. "I appreciate you coming," Roberto responded with a mixture of gratitude and residual pain, "but you need to understand that your abandonment nearly destroyed me and that I only survived because I found Alberto and we built something meaningful together after you made me feel I no longer had value or purpose." His honest articulation of the emotional impact of abandonment provided a necessary foundation for authentic dialogue about familial responsibility and intergenerational expectations. The ensuing conversation explored generational differences in values regarding familial obligation versus individual autonomy, the economic pressures of modern life versus traditional cultural commitments, and how modernization had eroded familial support structures that had previously provided security for the elderly. "We're not looking for them to come back and take care of us," Alberto interjected when the conversation became tense, "because we've built a meaningful life here that doesn't depend on familial validation, but we do expect respect and recognition that your father contributed to your lives in ways that deserve gratitude rather than abandonment." Their participation in the conversation as Roberto's chosen family demonstrated that meaningful connections could form outside of blood ties when biological families failed to fulfill basic responsibilities. The outcome of the visit was partial compromise, where Roberto's children agreed to regular visits and financial support while acknowledging that their father's primary relationship and community now existed in the mountains with Alberto and the support network they had built together, representing the reality that reconciliation did not necessarily restore previous relationships but rather created new terms of engagement that respected elderly autonomy while maintaining contextually appropriate familial connections. The cabin's evolution from a personal refuge to a community center for intergenerational education and cultural preservation represented a natural expansion of the original project, responding to needs identified through interaction with visitors and the broader community. The monthly workshops on traditional carpentry that Alberto began offering attracted both elders seeking to revitalize forgotten skills and young people interested in learning techniques that modern formal education did not provide, creating a unique space for intergenerational exchange that benefited both groups. It's incredible to learn these methods from someone who has practiced the craft for decades, commented a university architecture student who regularly attended workshops. Because I understand design principles completely differently when I see them applied in practice by a highly experienced teacher, rather than just reading about them in textbooks. His appreciation of the value of experiential knowledge validated the project's educational approach while demonstrating that craft traditions maintained contemporary relevance when presented in contexts that connected the past with the present. The traditional agriculture and herbal medicine program that Roberto developed attracted particular interest from women in the region, who recognized the value of ancestral knowledge about healing plants that modern medical systems often dismiss despite growing evidence of the effectiveness of natural treatments when applied appropriately. My grandmother knew all these plants, one young participant reflected during the workshop, but she never taught me because she thought I wouldn't be interested in ancient superstitions when I could study modern medicine in college, and now I realize how much valuable knowledge is lost when we assume that new is always better than traditional. Their recognition of the generational loss of traditional knowledge illustrated exactly the problem that Roberto and Alberto's educational project sought to address. The systematic documentation of traditional techniques that Roberto and Alberto began with the help of university volunteers created an archive that preserved cultural knowledge that might otherwise disappear when older generations died without passing on the expertise accumulated over lifetimes of craft practice. We are filming demonstrations of every technique that Don Alberto teaches, explained an anthropology student coordinating the documentation effort, because we want to create a permanent resource that future generations can consult even after the original teachers are no longer available to teach directly. Their commitment to preservation reflected recognition that traditional knowledge represented invaluable cultural heritage deserving of institutional protection similar to historical monuments or archaeological artifacts. The documentation project expanded to include oral histories from regional elders sharing memories of traditional agricultural techniques, social customs, folk medicine, and spiritual practices that had structured community life before modernization radically transformed rural societies. These stories are important not only for their informational content, observed the Oral History Project director, but also because they affirm the value of elders' lives by recognizing that their experiences constitute significant knowledge that deserves to be preserved and shared with future generations. Their analysis of the project's meaning connected cultural preservation with elder dignity in ways that made explicit how the two goals reinforced each other. The scholarly publications that resulted from the documentation project provided additional intellectual legitimation for traditional knowledge while introducing Roberto and Alberto's work to academic audiences who could amplify its impact through university teaching and subsequent research that would build on the foundations they had established. The intentional community model for seniors that Roberto and Alberto had inadvertently created attracted the attention of urban planners and social gerontologists seeking alternatives to institutionalization that would respect older adults' autonomy while providing community support necessary for healthy aging. What they have built here represents exactly the type of environment that geriatric research suggests is optimal for older adults' well-being, observed Dr. Patricia Hernandez during a research visit. Autonomy combined with community, meaningful work tailored to physical capabilities, purpose that transcends basic survival, and opportunities for social contribution that affirm continued value regardless of age. Her professional analysis of the model that Roberto and Alberto had intuitively created validated their approach while providing academic language that could facilitate replication in other contexts. The specific features that made their model effective included physical design that balanced privacy with socialization, flexible structure that allowed participation according to individual capacity without creating pressure that could be counterproductive, emphasis on contribution rather than passive consumption that affirmed older adults' agency, and integration with the broader community that prevented isolation while providing a support network that extended beyond immediate residents. The most innovative aspect, Dr. Hernandez continued, is how they have rejected the medical model of aging, which treats older adults as patients requiring professional care, replacing it with a social model that views older adults as active agents capable of self-determination and meaningful contributions when provided with appropriate conditions. Their distinction between medical versus social approaches to aging articulated a fundamental philosophical difference that explained why Roberto and Alberto's project produced such superior outcomes compared to conventional institutionalization. The interest that gerontologists showed in studying their community eventually led to longitudinal research examining health and well-being outcomes for residents, providing empirical evidence that would validate the model while contributing to the scholarly literature on best practices for healthy aging. The 2 years following the opening saw continued expansion of both the physical facilities and the programs offered, transforming what had begun as a personal survival project into a community institution that served multiple social functions while demonstrating the viability of an alternative to institutionalized elders. The addition of 4 additional small cabins on the property provided housing for up to 8 additional elders who could live independently while participating in the broader community according to their interests and abilities. Each new person who arrives brings different skills and experiences, Alberto explained as he demonstrated the expansions to visitors, which enriches what we can offer as a community while demonstrating that diversity of backgrounds increases rather than diminishes a group's collective capacity to create value and meaning. His appreciation of diversity as a community asset reflected a sophisticated understanding of group dynamics that maximized individual contributions through collaboration rather than competition. New residents included a former teacher who established a small library and began offering literacy tutoring for local children, a former farmer who expanded gardens to include a community agriculture program, and a former nurse who provided basic health education and first aid for a region lacking easy access to professional medical services. Each contribution amplified the project's community impact while providing elderly residents with meaningful roles that affirmed their continued value and ability to contribute to collective well-being. The participatory governance model they developed ensured that community decisions were made collectively with equal voice for all residents, regardless of how long they had lived there or how much they had contributed financially, reflecting a commitment to democracy and dignity that recognized that older residents did not diminish fundamental rights to participate in decisions that affect their own lives. The project's financial sustainability was achieved through a combination of resident pensions, income from workshops and the sale of community-produced crafts, and ongoing donations from supporters inspired by a story kept visible through periodic media coverage and a social media presence. We never wanted to rely entirely on external charity, Roberto explained during a financial model presentation, because sustainability requires that we generate real economic value through our activities rather than simply consuming resources that others provide out of pity or social obligation. His insistence on an economically viable model reflected a dignity that rejected dependency as the inevitable fate of old age, arguing instead that older people could be value producers when appropriate conditions were created for economic participation tailored to their capabilities. Income from the sale of handcrafted furniture, traditional textiles, and organic agricultural products generated enough revenue to cover basic operating costs while providing small stipends for residents that supplemented modest pensions. The social enterprise model they developed demonstrated the economic viability of productive aging while challenging assumptions about elderly dependency that justified institutionalization or social neglect. The tours they began offering, where visitors paid to experience learning traditional techniques directly from elderly masters, created an additional revenue stream while providing enriching social interaction that benefited both visitors and residents. Cultural tourism represents an opportunity to monetize traditional knowledge in a way that respects the bearers of that knowledge rather than simply extracting information without compensation or recognition, observed a community development consultant advising on sustainable expansion. Their analysis highlighted how the project had balanced economic sustainability and social mission without compromising core values about elderly dignity and autonomy that had motivated the original initiative. Roberto and Alberto's reflection on their journey from hopeless abandonment to social movement leadership provided perspective on human resilience and the transformative power of shared purpose in the face of adversity that could have resulted in very different outcomes. When Javier and my other children left 3 years ago, I honestly considered suicide, Roberto confessed during a reflective interview, because I felt my life had lost all meaning and that I was just a worthless burden to a world that had stopped taking me into account. Their brutal honesty about the depth of their previous despair provided a powerful contrast with their current realization that made their transformation even more remarkable. I was in a similar place when I escaped from the asylum, Alberto added, convinced that I would rather die with dignity in the mountains than exist as an object in an institution where your humanity is reduced to bodily functions that medical personnel monitor without seeing the whole person still existing within an aging body. Their description of their experience of institutionalization articulated exactly the problems with medical approaches to aging that their alternative project had so effectively rejected. What saved both of our lives, Roberto continued, was a chance encounter that allowed us to collaborate on a project that gave us purpose and showed that we still had the capacity to create value and beauty when society had written us off as finished and irrelevant. His attribution of salvation to a shared purpose rather than improved material circumstances highlighted the importance of psychological and social meaning over physical comfort in determining elderly well-being. Now we look back and see that our abandonment, although painful, eventually led to something much more meaningful than our previous lives had been, Alberto reflected, because it forced us to reimagine what was possible for older adults when we rejected limiting narratives about inevitable decline and dependency. His reframing of adversity as a catalyst for growth provided a philosophical model for resilience that could inspire others facing similar circumstances. The project's influence on public policy materialized when the Oaxaca state government adopted recommendations based on its model for a pilot program supporting senior living communities in rural areas. The Ministry of Social Development is allocating funds to replicate the model pioneered by Don Roberto and Don Alberto, a government official announced during an official ceremony. Because its success demonstrates that investment in active and productive aging generates social and economic returns that exceed costs while improving quality of life for the elderly population who would otherwise face isolation or costly institutionalization. Its economic justification for dignity-based social policy reflected pragmatism that could generate broader political support than purely moral arguments. The government program included technical and financial resources to help communities establish similar projects, training for community facilitators, and a regulatory framework that recognized senior living communities as a legitimate form of housing deserving of state support equivalent to other eldercare options. This represents a fundamental shift in how governments think about aging, commented a gerontologist consultant in program design, moving from a paternalistic model where older adults are passive recipients of services to an empowerment model where older adults are active agents receiving resources to create solutions that meet their own needs according to their own values. Her analysis of the paradigm shift highlighted the significance of political recognition of older adults' capacity and agency. Subsequent legislation guaranteeing specific rights for older adults, including protection against family abandonment, access to community resources, and freedom to choose living arrangements, reflected the advocacy influence that Roberto and Alberto had inadvertently inspired through their personal example. The policy legacy of their project would extend decades after their own deaths, eventually improving the lives of millions of older adults who would benefit from the institutional reforms that their story had catalyzed. The book the journalist wrote documenting their story became a national bestseller, amplifying their message about elderly resilience while generating royalties that Roberto and Alberto donated entirely to a foundation supporting abandoned elderly people. We want every peso earned from our story to go directly to helping others in similar situations, Roberto explained, rejecting lucrative opportunities to market their story. Because we never did this for money or fame, but because we needed to survive with dignity, and if our experience can make that easier for others, that's all the reward we need. His integrity in prioritizing social mission over personal gain reinforced the authenticity that had initially made his story so resonant. The book's title, Never Too Old to Start: How Two Abandoned Men Built Paradise, captured the essence of their message while attracting readers seeking inspiration about possibilities for personal reinvention at any stage of life. The speaking tours and media appearances that followed the book's publication provided an additional platform for elder rights advocacy while exposing Roberto and Alberto to a diversity of aging experiences that deepened their understanding of systemic challenges beyond their personal circumstances. At every speaking event, we meet more elders with similar stories of neglect, marginalization, or mistreatment, Alberto shared. And that strengthens our resolve to continue this work because we realize we are not exceptional. We were simply lucky to have found ourselves and the resources to do something about our situation when millions of others suffer in silence. Their recognition of privilege within adversity demonstrated a humility that prevented their success from becoming a meritocratic narrative that blamed other elders for not overcoming similar circumstances. Roberto and Alberto's final years in their mountain paradise were marked by profound satisfaction over lives well lived and meaningful contributions that transcended conventional measures of success. I never imagined that my final years would be more satisfying and meaningful than any other time in my life, Roberto reflected on his 78th birthday. But it turns out that purpose and community matter far more than youth or perfect health in determining whether life is worth living. His wisdom, gained through experience, provided testament to the possibilities for human flourishing in later life when fundamental psychological and social needs were met. When Roberto eventually passed away at 82, he was surrounded by the community he had helped create, including Alberto, fellow residents, local neighbors, and some of his children who had achieved partial reconciliation before his death. His legacy is not just this beautiful cabin or even the social movement it inspired. Alberto spoke at the memorial service. But the demonstration that it is never too late to create meaningful lives when you have the courage to reject limiting narratives about what is possible for the elderly in a society that frequently dismisses us. His eulogy articulated the essence of his friend's transformative impact while committing to continuing their shared work. The 3 additional years Alberto lived after Roberto's death maintained the project's momentum while carrying a more melancholic coloration from the loss of a companion who had shared the journey from despair to fulfillment. I miss Roberto every day, Alberto admitted. But I find solace knowing that our collaboration created something that will continue to benefit others long after we are both gone. His perspective on mortality reflected the peace that comes from knowing that life had meaning and impact that would transcend individual physical existence.